a red flag flying here.
Hello and welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Today I am here with Paul O'Connell. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm good, Paul. Thanks very much for having me on.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure for us. So we're just going to go straight into it. What is socialism to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mentioned just before we started that I'm involved with the Political Education Project, which is a new initiative in trying to build and develop independent working class political education in Britain, Ireland, and ambitiously the US, if and when we can sort of stretch that far. And the fourth session we're doing is what is socialism, and so the thing with that is because it's an education project, it doesn't entail us telling people what socialism is. It entails us asking people what they think socialism is, and then exploring some texts and some ideas in it, and trying to get a sense of where people stand on it after that. But for the purposes of this, I can definitely give you my own view on what socialism is, and it certainly isn't, for example, Rishi Sunak paying for people to go and eat out to help out, and it isn't the government covering people's wages to a pitiful amount for a few months during the middle of a pandemic. I mean, this is one of the things I'm sure you saw it yourself when COVID first kicked in, the first few months of it, the right-wing media in Britain and elsewhere saying that this was socialism, the state intervening, the state closing businesses in the state. And it's obviously not. The thing about socialism is that it's the antithesis of capitalism. Socialism is the negation. Socialism is the complete polar opposite of what capitalism is. So what capitalism is the sort of private ownership of property and the exploitation of the vast majority of people to the benefit of a small minority. Now, again, this can sometimes be misread and misunderstood as being sort of conspiracy stuff, but it's not that the small minority is out there pulling all the levers and making all the decisions. These are social relationships that people occupy. People are capitalists and people are workers, and the vast majority of us are workers. And because we're workers, the only way we can survive in a capitalist society is by selling our ability to work. So if we're lucky, we manage to do a job that we like, or at least don't fully hate. But the vast majority of people spend their lives going out and doing jobs that they're indifferent to, that they're unhappy with, but that they have to do because otherwise the bills don't get paid, the lights get turned off, there isn't food on the table. And because of that, then people don't get to live full lives. You know what I mean? We don't get to really develop relationships with our close friends, our family. We don't get to develop ourselves as people. If you end up being somebody, when I was younger, this is a long time ago, so some of the listeners might know this, but computers, old PCs, they used to have these little metal panels on the back of them that you'd take off if you wanted to put in an extra hard drive or put in the different things. And I used to work in a factory that nickel plated those. So for 8 hours a day, I'd hang these up on a hook, drop them into a bath of nickel, pull them out half an hour later, box them off and do the next load. And there are people who in different ways find themselves doing jobs, some, as I said, less horrendous than others, that completely deny them the possibility to develop themselves, whether they want to get into music or art, or whether they wanted to be carpenters, whatever it might be. So socialism is the opposite of that. Socialism is human emancipation. Socialism is the possibility for the vast majority of people to live fuller lives and to live in a more egalitarian and just social system. But socialism as politics is something else. So the socialism I described there is sort of end goal where we might get to in due course. Now, Lenin years ago said that trying to describe what a fully formed future socialist society would look like to a person today would be like trying to teach higher order mathematics to a chimpanzee. That we can't even imagine what it would look like because it would be so fundamentally different, because our material relationships would have changed so much and we conceive of things very differently. William Morris wrote a great book called News from Nowhere, where he imagined this sort of post-capitalist society and what it might look like. And it gives just some idea of, one perspective on it. But the important thing now is socialist politics. We're a long way from a socialist society. So how do we develop serious socialist politics? And that for me is one of the biggest challenges we face now. I mentioned the Political Education Project, and we start off, we're asking people to read a paper by a guy called Hal Draper, and the paper is called The Two Souls of Socialism. It was written in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And in that, Draper goes through probably the conversation that lots of us are having now. He goes through lots of different types of socialism. He says, right, okay, socialism is popular to some degree, and there's interest in socialism, and lots of people claim to be socialists, but what does that mean? And he identifies two big divisions: socialism from above and socialism from below. And he said socialism from above is almost nothing to do with the revolutionary tradition of working class people. Socialism from above is liberal reformism. It's the idea that you can get the state to give people food vouchers or whatever it is, and that's progress towards socialism. And in contrast to that, Draper defends or argues for socialism from below. And that's the type of socialism I'm interested in. The socialism that has as its starting point working class people emancipating themselves, working class people in all of their complexity and diversity, recognizing their shared interests, building organizations, whether it's trade unions, whether it's tenants groups, whether it's community mutual aid around food and so forth. And through that, coming to understand their shared interests and their opposition to those who currently benefit from the existing social system, the capitalist class, the ruling class, who make up a tiny minority of the population. So the socialism I believe in, the socialism I work for, is this socialism from below, working class self-emancipation. Now, that has all sorts of implications. It means that when you're trying to build organizations and when you're trying to develop programs and so forth, you can't simply have a good set of ideas that you hand to other people as the solution. It means that you have to work with people through their own battles and through their own point of self-realization to come to understand how they solve their problems. I don't know if you've ever come across Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator, and he's written a famous book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he starts off at this point. He says, the working class and the oppressed and the exploited, they have the answers. They know what needs to be done. They might not yet know they have those answers, but they have them. James Connolly, who was a Scottish and Irish Marxist, put it slightly differently. He said, there's none so fit to break the chains as those who bear them. And that's the sort of tradition of socialism that I belong to. That's the sort of tradition of socialism that I work to advance. One that empowers working class people, that isn't about working class representation, but is about working class leadership, and is about working class people forming their own sites of political and social and cultural power, and building out from that an alternative to the system we have now, which is dehumanizing, brutalizing, and fundamentally detrimental to human well-being. So I don't know if that answers it, but that's socialism to me.
That's a really brilliant answer, and every time I ask that question, I get a different answer, and it shows you how diverse people's ideas around socialism are. And that's something you alluded to at the very beginning. You know, that socialism is maybe different to different people, but that is a really good understanding. And I like the way you're talking about working class people. How do you define working class?
Yeah, again, that's another brilliant question, and a tricky one, and one that lots of people in different ways are debating at the moment. So I suppose there's two different ways of approaching it, or there's a range of different ways. But if we simplify it in an objective way and in the sort of Marxist tradition, the type of socialism that I'm interested in draws heavily on the Marxist tradition. A person's class is defined by their objective relationship to the means of production. Now, that's a mouthful, right? But the other way of putting that is, if you lose your job, are you out of the house in 4 weeks or 6 weeks? You know what I mean? If you can't live off unearned income, if you can't live off stuff that you don't work for yourself, well, then in an objective sense, you're working class. Now, there's another aspect to it, which is a subjective sense of it, and how people understand themselves as being working class or not being working class. E.P. Thompson, who you might be familiar with, and probably the listeners are, who wrote this great book on the history of the English working class, he said the working class was the first class that was present at its own birth, and it's a class that's constantly being reborn and remade. So there isn't just this static idea of the working class that stays fixed. It's not just lads in flat caps doing 12 hours in the pit or doing 12 hours in the factory and going home, or going to the working men's club and having a few beers. It's not this sort of nostalgic notion of it. It's anybody who has to get up most mornings and go out and sell their labor is working class. But forging a sense of people as working class and forging a class consciousness is something separate. Now, again, we've all grown up. We're all, whether we like it or not, Thatcher's children. Thatcher led a revolution in Britain, and it was part of a global revolution that Reagan was part of, and Pinochet, and then sort of right across Europe, the neoliberal assault on traditional working class institutions like trade unions. And this was also tied with a bigger crisis of capitalism that was happening at that point in time. But what Thatcher did successfully, more successfully than sort of anyone else I can think of at the minute, is she convinced people that these ideas of class and so forth didn't really matter. So Thatcher broke up, ideologically challenged the idea of society famously. She said, there's no such thing as society. There are individual people and there are families. And then she didn't just say that, but she went and bolstered that by a whole set of economic and social policies that she adopted. So, for example, the right to buy scheme that Thatcher introduced, in that sense, she was much more of a Marxist than most self-proclaimed Marxists, because she understood that you change people's material conditions and that it changes how they think, and that impacts how they think. So you create a whole class of people that hitherto were working class in publicly built council housing were now suddenly small property owners, and especially in places like London and that, where prices went through the roof, there were small property owners who could sell up, make a fortune, swan off to the Costa del Sol or somewhere else and completely augment how they see the world. So because of a whole range of things, because of stable jobs, for example, around mining and manufacturing and so forth collapsing, we've lost the traditional links that we had. There's still things that keep it alive, like the Durham Miners Gala, but the Durham Miners Gala really is something from another time. You know, it's beautiful and it's a lovely sort of retention of working class tradition and memory, but those jobs aren't there anymore. You know, that tradition isn't, you know, it's kept alive because it's important. But all throughout Britain and throughout the advanced capitalist world, traditional working class organizations have been broken down. So where we are now, we're in an era where the type of work people do and how they do it and where they do it has fundamentally transformed. So how do you build up solidarity and a sense of shared purpose and shared interests if all the people, you know, at the minute we're all working from home? So you're not in an office or a factory, or you're not in a pit with, you know, the same people for 10 hours a day, having lunch with them, having the same conflicts with the employers. Everything's been individualized and we're cut off from each other. And there's the gig economy and the way in which that isolates people and makes them individual contractors rather than employees. And there's a whole range of processes. So I think for me then, the working class still remains the vast majority of people, anybody who has to sell their labor in order to survive. And you can own a house and still be working class, right? If you own 50 houses and you're living off the rent, you're not anymore. That changes the situation. But you can be paying a mortgage for 30 years. You can be a homeowner and still very much be somebody who's working class. The real challenge for us now, and it's again part of what the political education project is about, is reforging that sense of class. There's a quotation that's attributed to John Steinbeck, where he said, the reason there's never been a revolution in America is because there are no poor people, there are only temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Right? Now, he never actually said that. It sounds like something he would say, but he never actually did say it. But that same thing sort of applies to some extent in Britain now. So since Thatcher, again, Thatcher and since, or every prime minister, Thatcher often said that Tony Blair was our greatest achievement because he carried on and even intensified an awful lot of what Thatcher did. But the shift then was away from ideas of social solidarity, of ideas of working class and having pride in the class background. And it was about scroungers and it was about welfare cheats and it was about strivers. And the government should look after those people who want to get ahead. And getting ahead means leaving everybody else behind and just look after yourself and maybe your little family. And that's what it is. And also the attack on unions, which started with the breaking of the miners' strike, but it has been carried on ever since then, and attacks on teachers' unions, attacks on the nurses' unions and everything else. And we need to find ways now, through political education will be one thing, but through also tenants' unions, we're going to need a massive campaign for unemployed workers in the coming years. And we need to rebuild that sense of people understanding their class position, understanding that their circumstances in life aren't freak accidents that inflict them as individuals, aren't failings of them as individuals, which is what an awful lot of modern culture tells people. You know, if you're not happy in work, do a bit of mindfulness and you'll be all right. Rather than if you're not happy in work, it's because you're working a shitty job and you deserve better than this, and all your workmates deserve better than this, and you can do something about that. So we need to be working on building that subjective element, because the vast majority of people remain working class, and there's a new composition to the working class in Britain, both in terms of diversity, in terms of sort of the type of work that people do. And so there's a big part of the job of rebuilding the working class is building anti-racism and building and fighting against sort of reactionary notions of what working class is. So you'll sometimes hear this term of the traditional white working class or something to that effect. Now, again, if you know Britain's history, you know that the traditional British working class wasn't pristine white by any stretch of the imagination. There's always been people of different ethnicities and races in Britain. The working class has always been much more complex than that. But even if it were at some point in the past, this sort of, blue Labour caricature of what a working class person is, there's no going back to that. Even if that was the case, and it wasn't, but there's no going back to that. There's only the possibility of going forward. And to do that, we have to shed all of these nostalgic sort of ideas of what class used to be and how good things were when we had stable jobs and so forth. We have to understand that now, as a class, the working class is in an increasingly precarious position. We're up against the wall because of COVID, because of economic decline, because of the climate crisis, and nobody's coming to save us except us. And we have to work hard to give people the confidence and the understanding to be able to do that. I hope that answered the question.
What you've done there is demonstrated why my interview style of allowing people to speak is perfect, because I could have come in at about 19 different points there and asked a question to find out a little bit more. And you actually ended up telling me a lot about it and about the way, cause for example, like, am I working class for being a teacher? Because I've previously, like, I worked through university in bars and things like that. I've been a cleaner. I've like worked in warehouses and stuff. And there's this awful thing that happens in education, I think, where because of Thatcher and because of that individualism, I've heard teachers tell people, you don't want to grow up and be a cleaner. It's like, well, why not? What's wrong with being a cleaner? Cleaner's brilliant. Like, some great friends of mine are cleaners, and I've been one myself, and it's quite interesting the way. Like, do you think that was a deliberate thing, like almost like a step on a rung up a ladder, like, and that's why people at the bottom rung of the ladder are more worried about people on a dinghy made out of Coke bottles than they are about a millionaire or a billionaire absolutely fleecing everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think it was, I don't, but sort of intentional in the sense of absolutely, it was part of the ideological project of naturalizing the system we have that creates inequality, that means that. So in Britain today, for example, there's 14 million people living in poverty, and 56% of them are in working households. So again, while the media has worked really hard, and this is like those rags like the Sun and newspapers like that, but also TV channels like Channel 4 and Channel 5 and so on, have run these sort of poverty porn shows around benefit cheats and and they've worked for years now to create a culture of people being suspicious, so that in the middle now of a pandemic, a global pandemic, where Britain has one of the highest, if not the highest, death rate in Europe, where we know that children are going hungry, where it's exposed that the company that's been handed billions or hundreds of millions by the Tories to provide completely inadequate food, where this is exposed, a response of people, liberals who think they're doing something good, is we need to give these people more, but give them vouchers so it won't be spent on fags and alcohol, right? Because again, we can't trust these pros, we can't trust single parents, we can't trust this, right? And again, this hasn't happened by accident. This has been built up. This sort of reactionary set of attitudes has been nurtured and supported over decades. And the thing about it is that it's exactly as you said, it's nothing new in the sense that if you went back 150 years when sort of Britain was forced developing as a capitalist power, back then there was still division between poor and so on, but it was also around the nationality. So there was loads of Irish poor who came over to Britain and people from other parts of the world, but mainly Irish. And the division was driven in there. It was like, don't worry about the boss who's rinsing you. Worry about these migrants coming in who are working for less than you will work for. So unfortunately, it's an old trick, but it's an effective one. You know what I mean? It's effective because people feel they can affect things that are more immediately proximate to them. You know what I mean? Like if you see the neighbor who got benefits while you are out doing a 12-hour shift, you can be angry at them. But the wealth that British billionaires have, which has increased 24% over the last year during the COVID period, British billionaires have increased their wealth by 24%. So while they're creaming it, you can't even imagine that, because they live in another planet for all intents and purposes. So if you are angry, and people are rightly angry, because again, it goes back to what I said at the start about a system that throws you around for most of your life. You have no idea of why you're having to go out and do this job, and what's a fulfilling life, and what makes you feel sort of whole within yourself and so forth. So instead of that, you get angry, you get frustrated, and you direct it at something, where you direct it at what you can see. And you can see the migrant family that just moved in. You can see the single mother who, according to the Sun and all these other rags, is getting, 64-inch plasma screen televisions while you're out working, your backside off. So it definitely is part of the, I don't want to sort of use the jargon, but it's part of the bigger sort of ideological state apparatuses. It's part of the sort of set of common sense ideas that make the world we live in legitimate and normal, and sort of give us ways of explaining it. And so going back to the political education project, a big part of what we're trying to do is trying to support people and equip people with a set of perspectives and ideas that break through that. You know what I mean? Because again, the common sense answer is very rarely the accurate answer. You know what I mean? The sort of received wisdom is very, very rarely true. And so political education becomes increasingly important because, again, particularly working class people don't get the education they need in normal state-run schools or in universities. And that's not because teachers don't work fantastically hard or university lecturers don't try hard. It's because of different pressures that are on them in terms of curriculum. God, I wouldn't want to be a teacher today with what Michael Gove did over the years and introducing British values and all this other nonsense. Or if I did do that, I'd subvert that. I'd be after the British values of the Lancashire mill workers who refused to process cotton from the slave South during the American Civil War, so they wouldn't undermine the sort of northern states. So I'd be all about those British values. The workers up in Scotland who went on strike to support people in Chile on the Pinochet. Obviously, that's not what Gove and others meant. But yeah, I think it is a serious issue. And I think, again, unless and it goes back to this thing about people being atomized and having the sense of being cut off and everybody's fighting for their own, or at most themselves and their family, we have to get people to understand. We have to work together to understand that what's happening to you is happening to the vast majority of people you know, because you're all part of the same class, and you can't solve it for yourself. You might get a temporary reprieve by getting a better job somewhere briefly, or you might get lucky and win something on the horses one week or whatever it is. But fundamentally, you're trapped in the same process. And unless we break with the systemic roots of that process, none of us are getting out of it.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on now to a question around liberalism. So we spoke about this a little bit before the interview, and so I think the left and socialists are quite often accused of the crimes of liberals. Certainly on Twitter, which is a really strange place. But so what do you think the difference is between like socialism that you've already outlined and liberalism?
So there's obviously with this, there's long and the short answers, and there's more complex and less complex. So obviously the first thing with liberalism is much like socialism, there are varieties of liberalism, so there's all sorts of different strands of liberalism, and it's a sort of rich tradition going back over 300 years or so. I suppose the fundamental difference, politically speaking, is that liberals always take capitalism for granted. So liberals, to one degree or another, whatever variant of liberal they are, they can be more socially progressive liberals, they can be more laissez-faire liberals, whichever variant of liberal they are, they assume capitalism. They assume that capitalism is the natural order of things and that we'll always have a capitalist society, and that the challenge is to perfect it in some way, shape, or form. So that's where liberalism at a fundamental level differs from socialism. Liberalism also differs from socialism insofar as liberals don't recognize or don't understand class as the main antagonism within capitalist societies. So if you're a socialist, certainly a socialist in the tradition I'm in, which draws on Marx and builds on that, you understand the fundamental contradiction, the fundamental social contradiction within capitalism is between workers and capitalists. Instead, for liberals, it's just a world of 7 billion individuals, all with different interests. And there are some discrete groups that have religious views, and some that have sexual orientations, and some that have interests, and they have to be balanced against each other. But ultimately, we're looking for consensus between all these rational, selfish individuals who all want to get the best for themselves. So those 2 points at a deeper sort of base level, that liberalism presupposes capitalism and sort of assumes capitalism will just continue, and that the whole political project is about perfecting or improving capitalism in some way. And as I said, because there are different strands of liberalism, some liberals will say we need to improve capitalism by having more capitalism. So you need to sort of scrap the state and sort of privatize everything, and then the magic of the invisible hand of the market will improve everybody's well-being. And then other liberals, in a sort of more social liberal, John Rawls is one of the most sort of prominent examples, says, well, no, we need some interventions here. We need to slow the market down a bit and put in place some institutional arrangements, but still, yeah, capitalism. And still, yeah, it's just individuals and we're trying to sort out their interests. A socialist, in contrast, sees capitalism, and certainly a Marxist socialist sees capitalism as a transient historical stage. So we've all grown up in capitalism. It's the most normal thing in the world to us. We've not known anything other than it. But in the history of sort of human development, capitalism has only sort of existed and has only been the dominant system, depending on when you want to start the clock. And there's debate about this, but for about 200 years, maybe a little longer, maybe a little less. And in the grand scale of human history, that's a blip. You know what I mean? Capitalism arose at a particular point in time. It became dominant through a protracted sort of historical struggle with prior systems of feudalism and so forth, and then it became the dominant system, and it's what we all take for granted now. And so a socialist approach understands that that has happened, and also holds the conviction that because of the contradictions in capitalism, because capitalism cannot, with the best will in the world, satisfy human needs, we need to move beyond capitalism to socialism and then communism. So that's a fundamental difference. And also the focus on class. So when you're a socialist, and particularly my approach to socialism and many other people, you look for the root cause of social conflicts in class relationships. So you don't get bogged down in questions purely of identity. You don't get bogged down solely in questions of individual interest. You look for the root class antagonisms that have produced particular issues. You try and build a politics then that is responsive to that. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore questions of identity. These are all important issues and have been an important part of the socialist tradition for generations, but they've been an important part of the socialist tradition as an aspect of the liberation politics that was integrated into a broader socialist politics. Unfortunately, what's happened, and sort of mentioned it earlier, and we talked about the decline in traditional working class organization and so forth. Well, since at the very least, since 1968, and then with the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, the defeat of the miners' strike, and everything else, traditional socialist organizations have collapsed all around the world. There are some exceptions. Cuba is an important but unique exception. In Bolivia and Venezuela in recent years, we've seen a resurgence, but generally speaking, socialist organizations have collapsed, traditional working class institutions have collapsed, and so socialist analysis has sort of drifted off the stage and has been replaced for the most part by sort of culture conflicts between people that call themselves liberals and people that call themselves conservatives. And rather than the debate being about who owns what in society and how can we transform that in a way which is fundamental, the debate then becomes about questions of religion, questions of race, questions of gender identity, questions of sexuality. That becomes the main terrain of debate, and that's a much more comfortable and hospitable place for liberal politics, because again, it just assumes capitalism is happening. There's nothing you can do about that. That's just there. But we can fight over these other issues, and we can fight over them in different ways. And some of that's been progressive. You know what I mean? The improvement in the protection of the rights we've seen of LGBT plus people, the improvement in sort of at least formal legal guarantees around racial discrimination and so forth. All of these things are positive. But actually, if you look at the evidence, the material position of BME communities hasn't improved alongside this formal legal recognition. LGBT plus communities, the Tories did the famous trick when Cameron was in government of, on the one hand, being liberal by legalizing same-sex marriage, while at the same time absolutely gutting health services for the LGBT plus community. So, you know, giving everybody formal equality, but fundamentally undermining people's ability to live decent, sort of well-protected lives. So the fundamental difference is then, I think, as I said, this relationship to capitalism and an understanding of class. And then there's also variations on what has been produced by the modern era of social media, which you mentioned already, Twitter being a strange place. And when we talk about a culture that isolates people and has people acting as sort of individual monads of sort of ego and everything else, well, social media is the perfect funnel to sort of amplify all of that. And especially in a culture that sort of has this perverse obsession with celebrity, where everybody wants to have a sort of minute of fame, you know, a tweet that gets 100,000 likes or whatever it is. So people will say stuff. And the terrain of social media allows people to win sort of empty victories. You can get someone cancelled. You know what I mean? If someone says something which you find offensive or you find objectionable, you can have a Twitter, social media pile on and get that person kicked off or whatever it is. You haven't changed anything. You know, you've gotten rid of one unpleasant person from a particular media platform, but you haven't touched any of the material basis that produces those ideas in the first place. So I think that liberalism is a set of politics that has become increasingly prominent in the last 30 years because of the decline of socialism. And I think that because of the decline of socialism, there are a lot of people who confuse liberalism and socialism. There are a lot of people who would genuinely, in their own heart of hearts, would consider themselves socialists, but who fundamentally are liberals to one degree or another in terms of their substantive politics. So you say, I'm a socialist, and you go, okay, grand, well, are you in your union? No, I'm not in my union. Are you sort of involved in building independent working class organization? No, I'm not doing that. What's your position on this? What's your position on that? And you invariably scratch it a little, and you find it's a liberal politics rather than any sort of serious socialist politics. I hope that's answered it, because there's a ton that can be said in this. So I don't know if I've.
Yeah, I think you've given a really good general description of what that is, and I know we could go on for ages and ages on that. There's one more in this area that I want to go for, and this is because sometimes when we do live shows, we have people who don't really understand certain terminology and stuff, and one of them is neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So what is that in relation to capitalism?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so again, there's a whole world of research on this, and there are slightly different views on this. So I'll give you sort of my view, which is shared with people like David Harvey, who would have a similar view in a way. So basically, say liberalism presupposes capitalism, and liberalism as a set of ideas emerged alongside capitalism. So again, in terms of the historical development of capitalism from the sort of mid 17th century right through the 18th and into the 19th century, as capitalism is developing in the Netherlands, in Britain and elsewhere, the ideas of a sort of ascendant capitalist class are reflected then in people like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, all the classic liberals, John Stuart Mill and others. Now, liberalism then was always linked to capitalism. The thing was, and that carried with it a set of moral ideas, a set of political ideas, but also a set of economic ideas. The basic idea being that the individual is the sort of main focus of political discussion. The sort of isolated, selfish individual is the starting point, and because of that, the individual should be left alone as much as possible and should be allowed to pursue their own interests in free markets. So that's influenced a particular approach to capitalism, which we refer to as sort of laissez-faire capitalism, sort of leave us alone. You know what I mean? Like let the market do what it does. And we've seen how that was applied around the world, and how that had absolutely horrendous impact on various people. In Ireland being one example, when the famine was happening. So we obviously had a particular natural event in terms of the blight on the crop, but the actual famine itself was made by the British government, by their policy choices, by their decisions to continue to extract food from Ireland when people were starving, and the idea that the market would sort it out, you know, so the sort of self-serving ideology. So the laissez-faire approach was sort of, and this is a big historical simplification, but was the dominant approach of states and capitalism in the advanced capitalist world, so in Western Europe and North America, right up until the First World War. And then with World War I, and even more so World War II, the state becomes much stronger. The state becomes much more involved in different, because it had to during two wars. The war economy forced the state into various sectors of industry and agriculture, but also the provision of key social services, including transport and so forth. And then allied to that, a set of ideas that are loosely socialist, social democratic ideas about the role of the state and what the state should do. And then the classic example in Britain is the NHS. So after World War II, after you've had the destruction of the First and the Second World War, after you've had the Great Depression, you get all these soldiers returning home. You get this sort of sense of national rebuilding and national rejuvenation. And you have this brief moment in the history of capitalism, and it's not just in Britain, but it's right across the advanced capitalist world. You have this brief moment where the levels of profit that capitalists are realizing are such that there's a compromise between labor and capital. So the capitalist class accepts some of the demands of the working class, and we get the welfare state, and we get regulation, and you get publicly funded education, publicly funded healthcare, publicly owned transport, pensions, sort of all these various things that an earlier generation, earlier than us, took for granted for a brief period. Now, The important thing to bear in mind here is that this is only a very brief moment in the history of capitalism, and it's only in a tiny corner of the world. We're talking Western Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, mainly, where this sort of welfare state period happens. But from the late 1960s onwards, all across the world, capitalists start seeing fall in profit rates. So the amount of profit that capitalists as a class are making are decreasing in important ways. We have the oil shock, which sort of exacerbates matters in the early 70s. And so neoliberalism then is the reassertion of these classic ideas of liberalism in order to justify rolling back the state in the contemporary era. So neoliberalism then comes, neoliberals, and again, the neoliberal thinkers were writing in the 40s and 50s, but they were considered to be madmen because everybody thought, well, no, the state has to be involved and the state has to be providing people with certain things. And the neoliberals were meeting in the Swiss mountains and they sounded like lunatics. So we went, oh, nobody believes in that anymore. But come the 70s, come the crisis of capitalism, the election of Thatcher, the election of Reagan, the dictatorship of Pinochet imposed by the US, supported by the US government, these ideas then are embraced by capitalists around the world in different ways, and there's variations. So some people would say, rather than talking about neoliberalism, we should talk about neoliberalization, because it doesn't happen the same way everywhere. You know, there are some similar patterns, but it happens slightly differently and unevenly. And in Britain, what it's meant, again, is this sort of ideology that emerged. Again, we mentioned Thatcher a couple of times, which is that the state shouldn't be involved in people's lives, that people should be self-sufficient individuals that look after themselves, and the market is sufficient to meet people's needs. So as a political theory and ideology, that's neoliberalism. More fundamentally, what it is, irrespective of the rhetoric and the language that's used, is it's been a political project. It's been an attack by the capitalist class on the limited gains that were made by the working class in that brief period after the war. And so we mentioned the miners' strike, we mentioned the sort of air traffic controllers in the US, how the neoliberal governments around the world broke up unions, introduced more stringent anti-trade union laws and made it more difficult to engage in trade union activity, how they rolled back public services, how they sort of break up the idea of public goods. You know, so my students now, I teach in university for a living, and all my students, at least the ones that are from Britain, pay $9,000 a year to go to university. And it's just taken for granted that's what you do. The idea that education is a public good that we pay for out of general taxation in order for society to benefit as a whole has vanished. And instead, it's each individual student as a consumer of a service in order to improve their cultural capital to advance their individual interests. So that's been part of the neoliberal revolution, has been that shift in thinking and how people view these matters. Even home ownership, you know, so again, there was far more council housing, good quality, secure council housing in Britain in the 60s, 50s and 60s. And from the 70s onwards with Thatcher, that's been broken up. And the ideology of home ownership has been really championed and pushed. And the idea that you're nothing until you own your own house and you can do whatever you want with it. So that's a short answer, believe it or not, as to what neoliberalism is. And I tried to be as succinct as I can, but there are sort of different views on this still, and it's an ongoing debate. And then some people will say now, well, with COVID and with the state stepping in and doing all of these things, that means neoliberalism is dead. And I think that's too simplistic, because again, neoliberalism did involve certain policies about rolling back the state, but they were only ever incidental or only ever sort of rhetorical and sort of an addition to the bigger project, which was about breaking working class power, advancing the interests of capital in sort of relation to the working class. And in that sense, it succeeded. So all the research over the last 40 years shows increasing inequality as a greater share of the world's wealth goes to the owners and to the capitalists, and workers see falling real wages for the last 40 years. So in that sense, it's been a triumph, and trade union density has collapsed and traditional working class organizations are in disarray, and people think Nigel Farage has answers for working class communities. You know, that's the successes of neoliberalism.
I don't know if I've got this a little bit wrong, but I often see the way things are going with neoliberalism is that like the state will support big businesses,
Yeah.
and you get this idea that like under neoliberalism, your general taxation or public money that's created is used to support these big businesses, which is probably why we've seen you mentioned the 24%
Yeah,
increase in wealth of the very richest.
yeah,
And it's like I think the whole idea of neoliberalism was based on trickle down, and
yeah,
it
yeah,
appears to be trickle up, and money
yeah.
injected by the state seems to be going up to those. Is that part of neoliberalism? Have I got the wrong end of the stick there?
No, I think you're right. I mean, so the thing about the state is important. So on one level, so again, there are different, like everything else, there are different varieties of neoliberalism, and there are neoliberal true believers. You know what I mean, who believe in the gospel of Hayek and von Mises and all these other people who are living up on the side of the Swiss, are meeting up on the side of the Swiss mountains in isolation during the 50s, and there are people who subscribe to that. Most governments over the last 30 or 40 years that have embraced neoliberalism haven't been true believers. Not really. They've adopted the rhetoric of rolling back the state, but they've always been happy to deploy the state in a way that benefits capital, in a way that benefits business. So again, even if we look at the example of Thatcher, the thing that Thatcher did is she deployed the state to create a market in home ownership in a place where that hadn't existed before. And the net result of that, I can't remember the guy, I think it's Brett Christophers, has written a really good book on this in terms of ownership in Britain. But the net result of that has been the individual working class people who bought their houses. Most of them sold up fairly quickly, and a lot of the stock of houses that was public housing that was sold to the tenants is now owned by sort of large investors, whether corporate or individual. And so it's led to a massive concentration of ownership and a massive concentration of wealth. And in places like London and to a lesser extent Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, it's led to sort of unrealistic rents for most working people, and the concentration of wealth again in the capitalist class and in the class of the owners as against most workers. So the state is always active. The utopian rhetoric of neoliberalism was about getting rid of the state, but was really just about changing how the state acted. And the state also always maintained its coercive capacities. So the capacity of the police and the military to break strikes, to control dissent, to deal with any disruption was always there. So the state today, in terms of what's happening in Britain in terms of COVID, again, it's similar processes. Britain today is a bit more peculiar in a way in that, like, it's a country where the ruling class now is openly criminal, is openly kleptocratic. You know what I mean? The Tories are making sort of no bones about handing money over to donors to their party to do things that are then never actually delivered, or to even do things that weren't even needed in the first instance, and then dragging their heels or being forced, by a celebrity footballer to feed kids for a fraction of the price. You know what I mean? Or to maintain the universal credit increase. Again, it shows how low our expectations have become, that fighting for people to have an extra 20 quid became such an extra 20 quid a week became such an important focal. And that is important, and it makes a real difference in people's lives. But our demands used to be so much higher as a class. You know what I mean? We used to demand and expect so much more. James Connolly, who I've mentioned a few times, he's got a famous sort of slogan that you might know, which is, "We only want the earth." That our demands are very modest. We only want the earth. We want everything. You know what I mean? And again, this pandemic, you mentioned cleaners earlier. Again, the people and a culture that sort of celebrates celebrity and celebrates sort of acquisitiveness and celebrates consumption would look down on cleaners because you don't earn much money as a cleaner, generally speaking. It's not a glamorous job, generally speaking. But I tell you what, when the whole country was coming to a standstill, and not just this country, but the whole planet was coming to a standstill because of a global health pandemic, if it wasn't for cleaners and that, we would have never had any chance, because they maintained the whatever shared spaces we had, and the sort of clap for heroes, which was always bullshit in terms of the government. It was always cynical. It was always dishonest. The people who went out and did it, I think, were genuine. People who clapped for it genuinely felt an admiration and respect for frontline workers, but the government obviously didn't. So in that sense, then, that in terms of the state's intervention, the state still prioritizes the interests of capital over the interests of the working classes, and it does it in different ways and again, the state is complex. We could do a whole conversation about what is the state and what's the nature of state power and how do we understand it, and that is an important discussion to have. But certainly the state in Britain today is very much one which is openly supporting and maintaining the interests of the capitalist class, and is patently failing the working class and patently failing the majority of people. But for a whole set of historical and fairly recent reasons, there's no real tangible opposition to that. The Labour Party is sort of toothless in the face of it because of its own reasons and internal battles over the last few years. The trade union movement has been hobbled, although the NEU again gave us a little bit of hope when they took the stand, which again, not backed by the Labour Party, which is an absolute travesty. But when the NEU took a stand and said, we're not going back to schools because it won't be safe, and it forced the government to change tack. So that shows the residual power of workers, of the working class. Unfortunately, we haven't got enough of that at the minute, and we need to be working to rebuild that, because if we don't, and with the climate crisis that's going to intensify in the coming years, it seems that sort of Britain's ruling class is very predatory, is very open in its sort of affinities, and that conditions will just get worse and worse for us as a class unless we force them to do otherwise, and we need to sort of mobilise around that.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely brilliant. So I've listened to you, and I've learned loads from speaking to you. And yet earlier on, you said you've got this political education project, which is to do with actually listening to other people and getting other people to decide it. So if someone who knows as much as you wants to learn from other people in this project, it's something I'm really interested in. So could you tell me a little bit about the background behind the political education project?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, of course. Thanks very much. So, the political education project was just launched on Sunday. So this Sunday just gone. You can find it on Twitter and on Facebook, and there's a web page as well, politicaleducationproject.org. And we set it up. I'm working with a number of comrades. So Laura Smith, who was a former Labour MP, has been working with us, and Sasha José. Joe Guinan from the Democracy Collaborative, which is a US-based think and do tank. They did a lot of support for the policies that were developed around the Corbyn and the Sanders campaign. And also Sean Boyers and Stephen Nolan from the Trademark in Belfast, which has been doing working class political education for the last 15 years all around Ireland, but also as part of the anti-sectarian unit in the north of Ireland in particular. So they got invaluable work they've been doing for years, but ploughing a fairly lonely furrow. So where this project has come from in part is that I moved over here 10 years ago, and I've been involved in sort of anti-racism campaigns and migrant rights campaigns, anti-austerity campaigns. I've been involved in my union, UCU. We've been fighting against the raising of tuition fees, fighting against job cuts, pension change. So I've been involved in a whole range of things. But the Brexit vote and everything around that really brought home to me the lack of understanding of some very basic categories on the broad political left. I understand the state power, the nature of capitalist crisis, the class analysis, what is the working class, what's working class power, how do you build it? So I was trying with a few different initiatives, including the Left campaign, which we established in 2018, to sort of engage in a form of political education in the Brexit debate. But the horse had bolted then. At that stage, it was just people screaming at each other and trying to introduce any sort of debate and analysis that was above are you a leaver, are you a remainer, was impossible. And so again, I've been arguing about, so this is biographical, but I was the first person in my family first boy in my family to finish secondary school, and the first one to go to university. So in lots of ways, I've seen firsthand on a personal level the importance of education, the benefits of it, what it can lead to. But then also I understand historically the central role education has played in building working class organisation, in building strong trade unions, in building strong, confident working class leaders. And that education has been decimated. So in Britain, for example, there was a very long tradition of workers' institutes. In Wales, for example, there was 100 plus miners' libraries that were funded by the miners who worked in the pits. And there's a great book called The Cultural Life of the Intellectual Life of the English Working Class. And the author in that recounts how a journalist from the Times is stood at a bus stop in the Welsh Valleys, and two lads who've clearly just come off a shift in the pit are stood just beside him, and they're discussing Einstein's theory of relativity because they've been sort of exploring this in the libraries. So there's a long tradition of sort of autodidactic worker self-education in Britain, which fed into building strong trade unions. And I'm sure we've all grown up, we've all known sort of working class intellectuals, people who left school at 8, 9, 10, but who could tell you, things about whether it was the natural sciences or politics, or certainly where I grew up, where people tended to get in trouble with the law. There was loads of guys who left school at a young age who knew lots of the law, who'd gained that experience in different ways. So it was clear to me that there was a need for political education. And then in conversation with different people, we started in Manchester with a group called the Beehive, which was again a number of activists who I knew, and then others who sort of had a shared interest. And the criteria was, are they working class socialists? Are they working class people interested in discussing these ideas and working on it? And we set that up March last year. So for the best part of a year now, we've been meeting sort of every 2 weeks, and we'll pick a topic, and the people in the group will pick the topic. So it's not a case of, as I said, like I work in universities and teach for a living. And in that context, I do set the curriculum and have a discussion with the students and walk through that. But in this, the approach to it is that it's about supporting people to learn what they want to learn in order to improve their situation, in order to understand their situation, to sort of get the grips with it and react on it better. So the Beehive went really well, and I was having these discussions with the comrades in Trademark and with others, and we could see that there was the massive need for something like this in Britain in a general sense. So recently we've had the Corbyn moment in Britain, which was really important and significant in certain ways. But at every point during that, there was a failure to establish serious political education. And I'd say, so I'm not a Labour Party member and don't want to sort of upset anyone, but the way in which the majority of the membership pivoted in a moment from supporting a fairly decent social democratic person to supporting the former director of public prosecutions, who was patently not a social democrat in any meaningful sense, speaks to that lack of political education, that the ideas that Corbyn and others were espousing in terms of policy had never really penetrated into the membership, let alone into the electorate, because again, that political education hadn't been done. So part of the understanding that I have of, and this goes back to when we discussed what is socialism, part of the understanding I have is that we won't have any sort of socialist movement in Britain unless we lay the foundations for it. The Corbyn thing was a fluke. Ed Miliband changed the rules on who could vote in elections for the Labour leadership. Corbyn got onto the ballot by the skin of his teeth. It was in the middle of a capitalist crisis. There was a general appetite for something different, and Corbyn got on. And then the British state and the right of the Labour Party spent the next 5 years trying to get rid of him, and they've succeeded in the end. But that was a fluke. The conditions, the foundations to support the Corbyn project were never there. Even though 100 and 200,000 people flocked into the party and were enthusiastic to do so, I reckon, and again, the numbers haven't been revealed yet, but I reckon at least 100,000 have left since Starmer has become leader, and probably more are just drifting off, and they're either not engaged in politics at all, or they'll join some smaller group or whatever it is. So what we're trying to do with this project now, the political education project, is to open up a space where anyone, these people who are in Labour, who've left Labour, people who aren't, I'm thinking of friends of mine who aren't political in a sort of traditional sense, but who do have views and ideas on a whole range of issues, and who don't have access to the sort of material and the resources to be able to think these through in terms of the history of socialism and the history of the working class movement. And so what we're going to do is, with the political education project, we're doing an initial 10-week course where we've got 5 topics. And for each topic, we'll do a 2-week cycle. So on the first day, Monday, the 1st of February is the first day, we'll post up a video and some readings. And the video will say, okay, we're asking you to read these 2 things here. Here are the points to look out for it. We're not going to say, this is what socialism is. The first topic is, what is socialism? We're going to say, have a read of these, which give different opinions on it, and then come back and tell us what you think. And then 2 weeks later, on the 14th of February, we're going to have the first Socialist Sunday School. So again, Socialist Sunday Schools were a rich part of the working class political education tradition in Britain for years, but unfortunately have declined for a whole variety of reasons. So we're sort of reclaiming that tradition, and we'll host these live Socialist Sunday Schools using Zoom and Facebook Live and stuff like that. And what we'll do is we'll lead off, we'll have a panel of 3 to 5 people who will be trade unionists, community activists, housing campaigners, and they'll start the discussion about what we've all read and what ideas we think are important today. And then we'll open it out to everyone. Now, we've had 2,000 people sign up in the first 2 days. It'd be great if they all turn up for the first Socialist Sunday School. I haven't figured out yet, and we haven't figured out yet, how we'll facilitate a discussion with them all, but we'll do our best. There'll be a lot of learning while doing with this, but we're up for the challenge because we think it's so important. And the reason we think it's so important is precisely because we understand, the people that have helped set up the political education project, we understand the scale of the challenge we face as a class. Long before COVID emerged, the global capitalist economy was heading into a serious recession. So this was on the cards already. Now COVID has amplified all of that. And we're going to enter into a period now, quite likely, of economic depression that will last for a couple of years. Mass unemployment is going to become fairly consistent for a period of time. This government, which is going nowhere for the next 4 or 5 years and quite likely going nowhere for the next 10 years, will use this as an occasion to again attack workers' rights, undermine living standards, affect a further transfer of wealth from workers to the wealthy. So as a class, we're under attack. And the way we see it in the Political Education Project is we have to be, and all of us will be, working in tenants movements and in our unions and so forth. But as well as doing those immediate fights, we have to be preparing people better for how we build an alternative to it. And education is absolutely crucial to that. I sort of like to give the example of Mother Jones, who you might have come across. She was an Irish immigrant to America, became a very famous trade unionist. She was once referred to as the most dangerous woman in America because of her political activities. So she's a very militant, active trade union. But she once said to a group of trade union members, she said, sit down and read, prepare yourself for the fights that are to come. So she understood the importance of education. There's no point in us just running off into the next action. There'll always be a next action. If we don't take that bit of time to reflect on why have we lost in the past, why have we lost recently, what is it that keeps on producing these conditions that impact on us so negatively, if we don't start to learn those lessons, we're just facing into more defeats. So political education will try and put that foundation in there. And again, it's not a party, it's not an organization or anything like that. We see ourselves as playing a role in helping to support the development of political education. And we want people to go off and start doing this themselves. The Black Panthers in the US had this slogan in the past of each one teach one, you know what I mean? So that people will do some political education with us, but we'll also be encouraging people to go into their union branches, go into their local community, to talk to their friends, you know what I mean? Your friend who might say something a bit stupid and a bit reactionary, instead of sort of dismissing them and writing them off, engage them, have the discussion, you know what I mean? See where that goes. So yeah, that's the project. It's ambitious in that sense, but we're starting off on sort of less than a shoestring. You know, we've got some support from Unite. They very generously sort of advertised what we were doing in their newsletter to their members. We got some financial support from the Lippmann Miliband Trust, which really helped. But we're all doing it at the minute voluntarily, except for one person who we pay to work a day a week to sort of move things forward for us. Yeah, and we're just hoping to build that up, and then, you know, if it's a success post-pandemic, what we'd want to do then is what Trademark had been doing pre-lockdown, is going into workplaces, doing one-day sessions and half-day sessions, going into communities, going into sort of local community groups, building up people's confidence around that, and then much longer term to link up all those people as well. You know, if we start to build a community of educated, engaged, and sort of ambitious working class people, then that'll be a force to be reckoned with in whatever comes next.
That sounds really exciting, and it sounds like you're actually employing socialist socialist thinking in how that's been rolled out. So really exciting. I hope a few of your students come along and watch a few of our What is Socialism videos, particularly this one as well. That'll be
Brilliant.
a good learning experience for people.
No, 100%, and that is it. So we will at the minute. So COVID limits what we can do in the sense that it's a sort of, we're using the model we've been doing in Manchester, which is attuned specifically to not being able to meet up in pub, you know, not being able to meet up together. So the online format is essential at the minute, but we're also going to try in due course. And again, it's not us. We don't have a set of answers. We have a set of tools that might help people to answer questions, and we're there to work with people to develop that, and we'll learn from it as well as the process develops, because again, there'll be people having experiences and engaged in struggles and involved in things that we're not, you know what I mean? So we'll all be learning in that process. But as well as doing the reading and looking at the theory and the history and stuff like that, we're also we're going to figure out exactly how to do this. We're going to integrate discussions of music and poetry and film and them as forms of working class education. There was a great Irish folk singer, and he had this expression. He said that the winners in history write the histories, and those who suffer write the songs. You know what I mean? And so where you are up in the northeast, I think of the Unthanks. I don't know if you've heard the Unthanks at all, and some of the songs they sing about, you know, Geordies being pressed into service for the military and trying to hide, and the sort of decimation of the working class. They've got this great song. The name escapes me now, but it's the testimony of a 10-year-old girl who was working in the mines Britons from up that part of Britain, and they put her testimony to song, and it's just sort of excruciating. You know what I mean? This young girl down the mines pushing, and that history again, sort of bringing that, because that is such a crucial part of it, because systematically working class people are failed by the formal education systems. One way in which we've kept their histories alive and learned these lessons was through song, was through poetry. So we'll also try and incorporate that. But again, we'll figure that out. There's a big part of learning by doing with this. We have some ideas of what the project will look like, but it'll be a co-learning project between us and everybody else involved in it. And that will sort of shape how it develops over time. And the way we want, again, we've set it up, we've taken the initiative, but we want other people to own it. You know what I mean? It isn't my thing. It isn't the group of us that are in there. We want other people to own this, because we think that's the crucial thing, is to get political education into the sort of mainstream of what working class communities are doing right throughout Britain, Ireland, and further afield.
That's a really good time for us to come on to what's a hopeful message for the future. So, because that sounds really hopeful to me, it sounds a really positive thing. So what are your hopes for the future? How do we bring around socialism into our lives a lot more? And obviously, what you've talked about, you've already answered that to an extent. It's about education, but how do you think we bring around socialism?
I think it's tricky. I think it's there's loads of cliched quotes about this. You know what I mean? There's one from Gramsci, the sort of Italian communist, that says the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions, without becoming disillusioned. You know what I mean? That you have to be able to look at the world and sort of see all the challenges and all the limitations and oppositions, but to be able to then work to find some sort of alternative. I think the thing to be hopeful about, I think one thing we have to be hopeful about, is that we do have an increased sense amongst ourselves that the system is fundamentally flawed. Now, the problem at the minute is lots of people are responding to this by being caught up in conspiracy theories and sort of, or some people just in sort of nihilistic resignation or whatever it is. But enough people are coming to see that this system, which sort of sees the wealth of billionaires increase while the vast majority of the planet is not able to work and not able to feed themselves and not able to leave their homes, and yet the wealth of billionaires is increasing inexorably, where we have the capacity, technological and sort of in terms of production chains and so forth, to meet the needs of people, but because of our social relationships we don't do that. So I had a meeting 2 or 3 nights ago with a CLP down in Harrow discussing Marxism in the British context and the history of it, and one example I gave to them was that in April or May of last year, when the pandemic was biting in the US, there was news footage, video footage of a queue for food banks in the US that was miles long. People were in their cars, they were queued back from miles. And on the same day, there was a report of farmers in the US who were destroying hundreds of tons, thousands of tons, I think, of food, because that food couldn't be sold profitably. Now, in the Marxist tradition, this is sort of the tension between use value and exchange value. That food is useful and people could could live off it and could gain nourishment from it, but it couldn't be sold for a sufficient exchange value. So it wasn't useful in a capitalist sense, right? So I think that in lots of ways, people are coming to see fundamental tensions and fundamental contradictions, but that doesn't guarantee that we'll get socialism, and nothing guarantees we'll get socialism. But I think that there's a crack there. So I don't know if you know Leonard Cohen at all. Leonard Cohen borrowed a line from Rumi when he says there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And so we have, because it is crisis, and because of what's happening, we have these cracks, and people are sort of looking for something, some alternative. Now we have to take the active step. We have to get in there now. And sometimes this will be sort of a longer process than we'd like it to be. I'd like a general strike tomorrow. It's not going to happen, right? So we have to then start laying the foundations to build a serious movement that will be orientated towards and led by working class people, and that will be about fundamental transformation of society, not just in Britain but much more, but globally, obviously. So I think that I'm hopeful in the sense that history shows us time and time again that sort of it throws up surprises. You know what I mean? You might know this, but famously in 1915 or 1916, possibly as late as 1916, Lenin wrote to a friend that Russia was a dead end and nothing would ever happen in Russia of any use politically. And of course, 1917, we know what happens. It's very different. Likewise, in France a few years ago, a sort of well-established French socialist, a left-wing guy, a radical guy, had said France is a dead end and nothing's going to happen here. And then Francois Hollande tried to introduce labour law reforms, which triggered the Nuit Debut movement, which was a mass protest movement against changing workers' rights and so forth. And that in turn has in complex ways fed into the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement in France, which again, in complex ways, is people looking for an alternative. It's confused and it's uncertain, and there are right-wing people in there, and there's anti-immigrant sentiment, but there are socialists in there and working class people, and people are trying to figure this out. So I think we have an opportunity, and I think we have historical examples that we can learn from and build on. And so I think that's where I take the hope from. I think there's no guarantees for us, but I think that history has shown us enough examples where ostensibly bleak circumstances can give rise to very positive, transformative ones. And I think that if we put in the hard work now of that serious movement building and laying the foundations for a serious transformative movement, that we can be ready for the next big fight. We're doing defensive actions now in the context of COVID, but there'll be another crisis, because that's how capitalism works. And if we put in the work in the coming years, and if we build up connections between hundreds of and thousands, hopefully, of working class activists who feel through their collective discussions and collective efforts in education a sharper understanding of what's going on, who understand you can't just vote in a nice allotment holder into number 10 who will then fix everything for you. That's not how it works. Nobody's coming to save us except us. And so to build up that movement and that understanding, I think is important. And I think that's the hopeful work that we can do. And again, no guarantees, but lots to work towards.
It's a brilliant way to end, and it is an uplifting idea, the idea that we can bring ourselves out of this. I'd love to thank you on behalf of Socialist Think Tank, Paul. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm sure our viewers have really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, and best of luck with the project, and I'll definitely be looking forward to future interviews as well.
We keep the red flag flying here.